In this episode, we're talking to Nancy Snow. She's the Program Director of Graphic Design at OCAD University here in Toronto, Canada. And I'll just tell you, Nancy has extensive experience as a designer, both in studio and research, and now as an educator. She brings a wealth of knowledge and deep thinking to the ways we learn and interact with the information the world presents to us. I worked with Nancy on my master's thesis, and it was the highlight of my graduate experience, forcing me, lovingly of course, to question things, to think bigger, and to dig deeper. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, Nancy, and for doing this for us. Before I jump into questions, I wondered if you could give us a little bit about your backstory and how you came to be a professor of graphic design at OCAD. It's always nice to know everyone's journey, to get to where they are today. So if we could hear a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Sure. Okay, cool. Yeah, and it's really great to chat with you guys as well. So it's gonna be nice. So how did I get here? Wow, it could be a really long story, but let's not make it a long story. I'll be brief. So I can tell you, why don't I frame it like my motivation to be here? Like why did I want to be an educator? And I think part of it comes from the fact that when I came to study design, I actually didn't come to study design. I came to study sculpture. When I first started out, and I actually thought, okay, well, I'll study sculpture, and then I'll go on and, maybe I'll get a subsequent degree in something else, history or English, or I don't know, something that I thought would complement an art practice. And I'm one of the first, I should say too, to contextualize it a bit, I'm one of the first family members. My sister and I are one of the first few family members to get a higher education. So I come from a family of wonderful people, but just people that didn't move on to higher education as their life progressed. So, heading into university and then into graduate work was very unknown. My parents were so supportive of and excited for us, but they didn't understand it. They're like, we're so excited. You're going to go do these things. We don't understand it. We don't know what you're trying to do. Good luck. Off you go. So I think framing it or contextualizing like that's really important, because it meant I didn't have sort of like even the illusion of a safety net in terms of support, because, when you haven't had a lived experience in something, you don't know anybody else who has either, navigating can be quite challenging. So I always think about how grateful I've been now in this moment, reflecting back of what it meant for faculty to support me in my education, who took the time to listen to me or explain things or meet with me after class, or, and then the people I worked with, for when I first started designing, like all of these people have contributed to my learning and my growth as a designer, as a student. And I think about those experiences a lot. So, I was a practicing graphic designer. I worked in all kinds of different disciplines. As you know, graphic designers, we kind of end up working with a great variety of different disciplines, different people. And so, because as I kind of made my way along, I started to realize that being a graphic designer, I had this great education in making things, but that there was only one component of what it meant to be a designer, and I think the other component is really culture. So I started to pick up on, I needed to know so many more things, because graphic design is never unto itself. It's always in relationship to a great many other things. So realizing that, I was like, wow, wouldn't it be great if that was actually put into the education? So when I was, it started to get more and more into education and started teaching, that's the area of interest in the practice I wanted to engage in, and I wanted to teach for, so that students, the next generation, somebody had contributed to my generation, I wanted to contribute to the next generation, but give more awareness and engage people's practices more with the cultural components of what it means to be a graphic designer, because so much of the education focus is on the making. So I think that's kind of the motivation of what's led to me being here doing this work. And how grateful am I to be able to do that? Like, what a great privilege to be able to teach.
So you're speaking about designing for education. Tanya and I both have backgrounds in graphic design. Like Tanya runs a graphic design studio in Mexico, and I have worked in advertising and marketing and publishing companies as a designer and an art director. So we're practitioners, but we aren't educators. How is it different to design in the educational context? Like to design curriculum or to design for other people's learning? And how do you know if your design is successful?
Well, I have a joke I make all the time that, like, on my gravestone, I'm going to have something that along the lines of, or the plaque on my urn, whatever ends up happening to me my body when I go, it's something along the lines of, like, at one point, Nancy almost wrote like a really good assignment. Like, she almost did it. It was so close. If she just had another 100 years, she would do great. So I think it's recognizing there's a lot of parallels with education and being a designer, I think, because you are like, you're designing for complicated systems. So, being a practitioner, you both know this, right? You're designing for all this complication. There's all these components. You're not designing for one thing. You're designing for, it's a context. You're designing for people, and you're designing for various people, and you don't even know who you're designing for half the time, because who knows where, like, once this thing that you make goes out into wherever it goes, what happens to it? How do you track it? It's not like we have a little tracker, or it's not like we have, we can capture people viewing what we do. Maybe we're starting to, but you know what I mean, right? Like, it's very challenging to really like follow through the life cycle of something you make. And graphic design is so ephemeral too, right? So it's of the moment, it's instant. And then, it goes away and the next thing comes. So but I think that there's a lot of parallel with that to being a graphic designer, right? So it's a lot of the practices I think you use as a graphic designer, you bring into being a teacher, because you're trying to make connections with people. And so one of the beliefs that I really became aware of when I was doing my my graduate work, the thing I became aware of is that what I wanted to pay attention to as a designer, and what mattered most to me was the communication part, right? It's about like that access to information. How do I access information? How does somebody do it? What do you include? What do you exclude? Because in graphic design, there's often a reduction approach, like reduce it down to its simplest form. And wait a minute, we'll talk, I'm sure, later about like that, the problem with that. But really, like, it's the same with education. How much do I give you? Like, how much information do you need to do the thing you need to do? So in a classroom, you have all the components of a studio classroom. You've got an assignment, you've got a grading rubric, you've got critique, you've got the physical environment, you've got your peers. There's all these components that come together. So how do you foster a space with all these things coming into play, many of which you don't have control over, nor should you? And then, so what do you bring into that? That's kind of the trick of it. So I feel like that's a lot to do with the designer. What gets included? What don't you include? What can you augment depending on the person's needs in front of you? Because the students have the goal and the learning of the assignment. They have to learn something, right? They're going to do something, make something, think something, share something, iterate on something. But then, on the other hand, what are their goals as individuals? What are they coming with? What do they want to do? What do they want to achieve? So those two things are kind of living in, like, in articulation with each other. So when I think about all of that, how do you plan for that, right? And then how do you know if it was effective, which I think is like the other part of your question too, right? Like, how does it work? Does it work? You don't know. So a really applied thing I do to kind of figure that is I do a lot of reflective writing with the students. So I never mark or I never look at a project without them having some kind of verbal, whether they speak it or whether they write it, to share with me what they did when they made this. Because then, if I'm just marking, like if we all do graphics for a cup, I don't know, we don't ever do that. But it's just the thing in front of me. We don't ever do that.
Yeah, we understand.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. If we did that, like, how do I put it? Like, it's never just about the object. It's about the intent behind it. It's about how they got there. It's about what they tried to do. There's so many pieces. So if they write about their making and they tell us what they did and how they got there, that to me is always more interesting. Otherwise, I'm marking myself. I got to see this. I can see that. Who cares what I see? It doesn't matter. What did they do? So if they tell me, that I'm far more confident to I'm far more confident I'm closer to marking them and giving them feedback on them versus what I think. Because really, like, who cares? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter what I think of their work. It matters what they did and what they learned. So, yeah. So I think there's a lot when you're putting things together. That reflection often then too guides what I'll do next year with that assignment. Because I see a pattern when I look across those reflections, like if people were missing something and there was more, there's like half your class is missing a certain detail, that's on me. I clearly didn't communicate something properly. I didn't help people make connections. So, you look at the ones that did, and then you try to figure, so it's like putting together a big puzzle all the time. I think that's probably the way I would sum it up.
You're always collecting data.
Mm-hmm. Always.
Researching.
Always. It's how my brain works.
For me, like Soya said, I work I have a design studio in Mexico City, and many students that just graduate come and work with us. So I have many individuals that graduate and start, because one of the things, since we're a small studio, that we've been able to hold is that we never hire on top of you. It's always like a little ladder. So in that sense, everybody, if someone goes away, it's not that sad, because the ladder you will be, and we're constantly trying to make the designers work to be prepared. So the new designers are always just graduated, and so when every time they get in the studio at the beginning, we always see them with like scared eyes. They're always really scared. They're very nervous. And the thing is that I see that once the speed is something that the action that is in the studio is one thing they have trouble, but they get adjusted. Yeah. The thing, and that's where my questions goes, is with the thing that I see them struggling the most is the relationship with the client. And that's something that we take a lot of care with them, and we don't release them that openly, because clients can be tough, especially, I don't know how it is in Canada, but in Mexico City, they are tough. They are not so nice while to give feedback. And sometimes we've seen that they are very rude, especially if they see that they are young, and especially to some women, we have found that. So I have like an area of opportunity. I always make the same mistake about like bias action, that I get like super angry, and I just say like, no one treats people like that in my company. And I would like get super mad, and then I realized that isn't always the way to go, as helping them, give them a voice. But I've always struggled with that. Like and I feel like, how can I solve that? How can I help with that?
Right. So I guess you're kind of looking for a way, like there's a few things there, I think. Are you trying to find like a way to empower them? Like you want to empower them and teach them. Yeah. Isn't that a tough one? Like we all know that, eh? That is like the biggest nut to crack. And I know, and it's funny, I remember when I was coming up designing, there was one of my classmates I graduated with, he and I used to meet up on occasion, and we'd meet up sometimes at like midnight at this like restaurant, and we would, share stories and ideas, because we were trying to like recreate our student support networks together. Mm-hmm. And be like, how do you deal with this? Like, how do you present, or how do you get across what you're trying to say? Because you realized half of your job was making, but this other half was this compelling language you had to come up with to convince people why they wanted to take a certain approach. Or yeah, so it's funny, this almost connects back to the very first question, right? Like, as a designer, aren't we always kind of educators? Because I feel like I spend so much of my time, even to this day, when I meet with a client, like or in a client position, I have to like educate them on what they actually want. And I don't mean that like, I'm going to tell you what you want. I mean, like, they don't even know really what they're asking for, right? Or how they're asking for it. Like, recently someone asked for something and they were really alluding to spec work. And then I had to go on this whole thing where I had to explain what spec work was, like how no one goes to an accountant and says, okay, there's 3 accountants in line for this job, so I'd like you to tell me how you're going to work the books for this. And then if I like how you do it, I'm going to hire you, so you better do a good job on the like, no one does that. That's bananas, right? So like, I don't ever think of that happening. So, when it comes to this idea of like relating to clients, or how do you get them to do that? That is a really tough thing to do, because there's a lot of moving parts to that, right? So I think I feel your challenge. And so do you model behavior? Do you get them to practice in advance? Because they really also have to be like improv artists too. Do you know what I mean? Like, you have to think in the moment, like, how do you frame, how do you tell a story? And I think, storytelling might be a great way to start with new designers, because then they can learn how to tell a story to relate to the client. And I think sometimes that can be a great method, because it's also a really great research interviewing method. Zoya, you know me, I'm always like, tell me a story. I love it. But it can actually be a great way, right? Like, so people tell you a story about what they want, or if when you're sharing your design work, you're telling them a story. People remember stories, they can go back and share them with other people. And they often they lower people's defenses, because you're right, clients can be rude and they can say really rude things. And even though you're talking about something that maybe has to go out to, say, a certain audience, right? Like, let's say you're talking about something that's got to go out to an audience. And because you have a particular targeted space for where something's going. And they start talking about their personal interests. Like, it doesn't matter that you don't like blue. It's not for you, right? Okay. So I think it's that kind of thing. It's like, how do you help someone see their own biases? How do you help someone see, and there's a power dynamic at play too, right? Like, there's a job on the line, right? So this poor new designer coming in, they need to uphold the company value they work for. So for your studio, it would be, they'd be looking to you. They're also looking to the client. If they make them angry, are they going to lose the job? Are they going to get fired? So it's, there's a lot of power at play. So I think it's about maybe starting with the power dynamics.
For sure.
And recognizing it like that. But I don't know, like, what have been your strategies? I'd be curious to, like, your go-to thing is kind of like getting angry, but yeah. But I'm so curious, like, that's where I would go and ask you, tell me your story. Where have you helped that young person? Like, has there been a moment where you've had somebody have like a really successful moment?
Yeah, well, like, we've always said that from the beginning, that there is that we won't allow, like, always calm them down, saying that we will always protect them versus the client. So when it comes to being rude, so that it's not allowed, and that we can't always defend them, because sometimes like, growing up means starting to get to know clients and run the projects by themselves. And that's something that they also find interesting, because most of them go on and do their own studios. So there's something they want to learn, but at the same time, they're a bit scared. So what we've done is, for sure, I'm just saying that never on the phone. Like, if they're being rude, just like in the most possible way, just like cut the conversation close and say, with this conversation will continue by mail or with chat, or Tanya or my other associate will call you. And that's how we start. And we always, like, what's happened, like, a little bit that it has helped is for starting, I always say, like, to the client, that we don't work like that in the studio. Like, we do not communicate. Like, none of these designers are used to being yelled, because we don't yell.
Right.
And they're not used to being rude because we are not rude. So that to start it like this conversation is a shock. And by seeing that we don't get mad anymore, like the designers, this was like again when I engaged in defending and it didn't work. So now it's like we stay as calm as possible, and it's like we won't get mad.
Right.
Even though we've been faced with many very, very, very unethical and wrong things that you would be amazed. Like, yeah, I remember once that I was in a place and they were doing we were designing a product that was like very expensive, and the designer that I brought came. It was obvious he came from a background that maybe he had never afforded that or whatever. A service, it was a very high. And like in front of that people, he said like, why do you bring someone that can't even afford it in front of the designer? So I was like, take like 30 breathing and don't answer and that kind of stuff. And then we end up giving up that job. But like you say, like the designer is watching me and the client is watching me and saying, what's going to happen?
Right. Yeah, so much is on you. I think, but you know what's interesting about that too is that all of that is so baked in what we do, right? Is class, right? Yeah. Like you want to say, would your mother want you speaking to somebody like that? Like, does your mother know you just said that to somebody? Like, you should be ashamed of yourself. Like, that's a terrible thing to say to somebody. Yeah. So that's terrible.
Clients they tell me like, when does your boss will come? And I'm like, I'm here. I'm the designer. And they're like, you? And I was like, yeah, me. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I bet if we did a poll and we polled every female designer, they would have a story of that. Like, I don't know anybody that doesn't have a story like that, being told that, oh, you're the designer? Like, yeah, it's me.
Yeah. Yes, I guess teaching that has been hard, teaching them. Just they graduated from normally they're very happy environment. They're very proud of their university. They love their teachers. They come like super happy and then hearts broken by the clients.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's the hard thing too. It's like, this is a question we always have too, because, you know, like, what are we teaching when we teach graphic design? Like, what's our, like, you know, the 4 years goes by so fast. So when we think about it, we're so focused, I think, on the practice of design. And then I know my focus is not only the making practice, but all the other pieces that kind of come along with it in terms of culture, notions of good taste, those kinds of things. So, you know, getting at those things are kind of a tall order. And then how do you add in this like coding on the outside of all of that to help them transition into a workplace? And to me, I don't know, like we have amazing group at our university at OCAD with they're called CEAD, the CEAD, which is the Center for Emerging Artists and Designers. And so they're kind of like this co-curricular piece for us, because I think separating the two out I feel like that seems like it's helpful. So having the academic, the teaching of making and design, and then having this other like connected piece where students can go and learn those kinds of things that you're getting at. I think that I really see a great future with the relationship with that particular group at the school, because then they can focus on that. Because I really think it's like it's related, but it is a different set of skills. Right? Because I mean, what do I want to do? Do I want to create a classroom where I'm yelling at people so they can get used to being treated badly? Oh, I definitely don't want to be doing that. Terrible. Like, that's not the kind of education. I want to do more of what you're doing, where people are establishing meetings with respectful rules in place. Like, this is how we're going to speak to each other, and this is how we're going to conduct ourselves, and establishing those good behaviors and practices. I don't want to be teaching students how to be abused in the workplace by being yelled at, right? I don't want to contribute to that. So I think having this co-piece, this co-curricular piece, I think has been, like, it's been very successful so far for so many students. But I just think that I want to see that part of it grow more, because I think, and I'm so grateful for the relationship with the folks that work in that department. They're the best people. I just think they're fantastic. They work so hard and they're so diligent in protecting the students' rights, ensuring good contracts and negotiations. Like in February, a couple of the faculty are working with that group to produce like a pricing workshop. Yeah. So what's going to happen with that group is, so it's between faculty, it's between the CEAD, and they're going to come together. And because we've had so many students because of COVID graduate, but then graduate into freelancing. And so now they have to learn how to price things. So they're starting to realize the things you're pointing out, how do I work with a client, is something that they're missing. And so having those workshops that are directly targeted to those things, I think it's going to be a great experience for the students. And who we're bringing back to do it is other like recent graduates who've had the experience to do that kind of pricing and that kind of work, to come back in to share their experiences. So these are people that, that peer-to-peer kind of works, instead of having somebody come and talk, that's so far removed from them. So I think that piece, I feel really good about it. And I hope that we get to build more and more of those kinds of relationships as we go. So that way, when you running a studio hires somebody, they've got a bit of that experience, and it doesn't come from the academic side of the house. It comes from this other side. And I think having the two separate is also a good strategy for like a few different reasons. But I think it'll kind of start to address the things you're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
That sounds exciting, because no one taught me how to price, right? Like, and I kind of floundered, and sometimes I still don't know what to price. It's always like a learning curve, like a very steep learning curve. So I think that's really exciting.
Well, it's such a different skill set too. It's project management, right? So it's project management and accounting. Like, I don't know, as a as a designer, you're almost a director, right? Like, I've got to learn all these different things and coordinate them all. It's, you're juggling all these balls. It's just, whew.
So you spoke a little bit about power dynamics just now, and class as built into what we're doing, and culture. So that brings me to my second question of decolonizing design. So OCAD has this initiative about decolonizing design, and I know there's a lot in design and in art that's a part of a class structure. And I wondered, in what ways do you find part of decolonizing design education as necessary, and how does that trickle into graphic design? Or let's just say, how does it trickle into visual communication? Because I think at OCAD there's graphic design, there's also an advertising program. So how does it trickle into visual communication?
Yeah, so in the design faculty, we have advertising, illustration, graphic design, material art and design, industrial design, and environmental design. Oh man, I hope I didn't forget anybody. Oh, forgive me, gang, if I forgot somebody. I think I did all right there. And so yeah, so there's a lot, and yeah, so you can see there's communication design, fabrication. We've got lots going on there. So institutional wide, we have what's called our academic plan, and that covers this component. So as a community, the entire institution has like a set of values they're working towards. So there's lots of initiatives across the university as a whole to address, to start to address and start to work through, what does this look like in practice, right? Because when you read an academic plan, they're always lofty, right? They're almost more visionary, but it's like, how do you make those things actionable? So, that's where many of us are interested in working. So the idea of decolonizing design really gets forefronted by the dean, Dory Tunstall, because that's her platform that she's building out as a way to talk about it and as a way to share it. So what does that look like to decolonize design? And it does need, of course, it needs to be decolonized, because if you think about what graphic design is, it's born out of the Industrial Revolution, right? Like mass means of production led to the need to reproduce things. But look at the ways in which it's gone. It's a very much practiced and still taught in many ways, not everywhere and not all the time, but there's a great deal of approach taken up, which is about reductionism. The simplest, keep it simple, keep it clean. Like, how many times have we heard that language when we talk about design? But what does it mean when we say that? Keep it clean. Ooh, whoa, that's loaded, right? Keep it simple. What does that mean, right? So we think of these graphic forms, But what are we really doing when we do that? Is it like, are we erasing culture when we do that? Well, that seems pretty colonial to me. So, we see examples of it all the time, right? Because, you know, um, different cultures create graphic design in different ways. Different aesthetics are appealing to different groups of people. So, there's not one way to make graphic design. There's like many, many ways, and for many different reasons. So we have to look at like, what languages do we use? How do we frame things? What examples do we give in our classrooms? So, like, let's look at just some very basic components of the studio classroom space. Who is prioritized in those spaces? What work do we show? How do we talk about that work? How many great male designers do we have that we are just now starting to realize had women who were in the same positions in them, had the same titles as them, produce the work we look at, we didn't even know those women existed. Like, that's, there's this myth. I think you look at TV shows like Mad Men, that popular advertising piece, and they act like that one character is the first female to ever write ad copy, which is ridiculous. Tons of women wrote ads, tons of women did all kinds of work. They're just never spoken about. They didn't make the magazine covers, they didn't make the documentaries on design, they didn't make the history books, right? So it's, there's so much work that we have to do in graphic design, about how we speak about our work, how we showcase our work, what work we prioritize to show to our students. So I have an amazing colleague I worked this year with, Michelle Astrug, for our second year course, and we're doing motion design in it. So we looked at a lot of video work. So her and I made a commitment that we would ensure that the bulk of the work we showed, whether it was the work of the people behind the camera or in front of the camera, that they would be representative of a great many cultures and great many makers. So we forefronted like Indigenous directors and Indigenous makers. We forefronted all kinds of BIPOC community members, Black artists, designers, because we thought, like, if you're in the room and we're showcasing you, why are we showcasing only a bunch of white people, which happens a lot. Like, if you do an audit of the examples in classes, it's a bunch of like white people and it's a bunch of white men. So why are those the only people that get to be showcased? Great many designers out there. So we purposely set out to do it. And it seems like, shouldn't we kind of always been doing that? It seems like silly that we never even, like, why aren't we doing that? So we, that's what we chose to, focus on. And, like, as one small component, but there's tons of others. How do we speak to our students about the ways in which they make things, what they're trying to do, how we frame critique. So there's so much of the language in the components of the classroom that come from these colonial structures that we need to start to work to get rid of, right? Because they're doing harm in the classrooms. And it's interesting, we had a student who graduated recently who came back who's struggling to find work because those spaces aren't available in practice. So that's the other piece. Like, we're doing this work in the classroom, but what happens when the student leaves us? And because they come in as juniors, or as they come in as these emerging designers, they don't have the power to affect change. So they come into these hostile environments that don't have this, and it's a concern. So, how do we help the students navigate that? So I'm hoping that next year, that's something maybe we can have talks about or address, to say, okay, what are you experiencing when you're going into studio? Are you getting yelled at? Right? Are those comments getting made to you? Or you're the designer, like, to the women who step in the room? And a lot of our students in our classroom, they're women. So we, like, how do we address that? So what are we doing for the design community at large to do this? Because it's great that we at the institution are looking at these things, but, these students leave and go out into systems. Are we positively affecting change within the systems themselves?
Do you think there's more female designers than male designers? I was just thinking as you were speaking about mostly females in your class, and I was just thinking that the art department at work, which is more than 15 people, I can't count them all, I might be leaving somebody out, but it's more than 15 people and we're mostly women. Are there more female designers than male designers, you think? Yeah.
I'd love to, we should look at some of the organizations and see like the AIGA or the RGD. It would be good to look at those groups and say, who do you have as your membership?
Yeah.
How many of your members are male? How many are female? What are the demographics of the community? It'd be really interesting to see what that breakdown would look like. But I know in the classroom, I'm seeing a lot more females. When I started studying design, there were far more men than women, but that's changed over the years for sure. Way more women in design than classrooms.
It seems to be a little bit of a trend throughout all design disciplines. I think that's the way it's moving, because I think also we were talking about something, I don't remember what we were talking about, but we were talking about architects the other day, Tanya, and I know like architecture was it was very male dominated in the past, but there's a lot of female architects now that, I don't know, it's the age of female, that's all I'm saying.
But I know lots of women who are in architecture, and it's still a tough go. I remember when I started practicing graphic design, I realized I had to build a good relationship with printers. So I learned how to drink scotch, and talk about scotch. So I had to perform super male to work with a lot of printers, and they were lovely men. It's not that they were rude to me, but I knew. They could feel it. You knew how to negotiate your spaces, because you're like, okay, I need these guys to listen to me, because if I'm going to be on press with this guy at 2:00 in the morning, I need him to hear me. I need him to believe I could do this work, and then I knew what I was talking about. So yeah, isn't that like, here I have to appreciate scotch just to be able to like throw down with these printers. It was nuts.
I do remember as well when we started the inclusive design program, and it might have been the summer intensive, and we had Gail as one of our professors. She's lovely, and her background's in architecture. And I do remember her sharing like her stories, like, it was she's tough. She's very tough. She came from a very male space and so forth.
Yeah, and it's wrong, right? Like I kind of resent it now. Like, why did I have to behave that way? Like, who am I? Who am I really? Like, as a person, I don't even know sometimes, because I'm like, you're formed by your experiences, and I think, like, who would I have been if I didn't have to behave that way?
Yeah.
Like I think about that I think about it often. Like, what would that have been like if I don't know, if I'd grown up in a different way, or seen things a different way, or experienced things in a different way that weren't so, like, that didn't teach me I had to perform male in order to be successful, and I think you see that in a lot of our elders, right? Like, a lot of the women that have come before us, there's a pattern in how they behave. And I don't, like, there's enough consistency in those patterns where you say, did we do that to you? Did our environments do that to you, that you need to function that way? I don't know, it's kind of super unhealthy, I hope. And that's hopefully the change we can make too, right? Like, with this next generation, like, I think some things got better with us, but what about this next generation coming up? You guys don't have to behave like that. Like, you don't.
Hopefully they don't. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to do that. Like, we can just, we're all here to make stuff, and we don't have to do this to be heard or seen. So yeah, that's kind of the name of the game, I guess, right? What we're trying to do. These are the kinds of things I think people need to hear too, right? The next generation kind of coming up. And I think even ourselves, we need to remind ourselves that we don't have to do these things. Like, these are traditions that came up. And if we stop and think about their origins, like, where did they come from? Why are we doing this? And do we have to keep doing this moving forward, right? Like, I always kind of think, when we talk about things like decolonization, or we talk about things like, these big systemic changes that we need to do, I'm like, it's easy to go after the overt, right? Like, when we think of like a bad guy, the twizzling the mustache, tying the woman to the train tracks, old timey bad guys, like, it's obvious to be like, that's the bad guy, right? But that's not how the real world works at all, right? And I mean, the real world, what does the real world even mean, right? Like, what does that even expression mean? But it's in all of us. Like, these things are systemic. And so it's like, as a person, you've got to go through and say, okay, what about, like, I've grown up without questioning certain aspects of my life. So now I need to do the work, not only in, with the university, but also personally, because I don't want my children growing up this way. right? I don't want to go out there and do harm because I never thought to question some of the expressions I had. I never thought to question. And every now and then I think, oh man, what have I done over the years where I did harm and I didn't even know I'd done it? So I think that it's personal too. You have to do the personal work. So I know like my sister and I, we get together and we'll read books together. So we read like Decolonizing Wealth, and looking at how the structures of wealth have led to these systemic issues, because again, we're all part of this big ecosystem. So it's not just design that needs to change, there's like aspects of our lives that need to change. And so I think if I start that work personally too, right, with my family, with me, then I think that's a part of it too, because then I'm just like I'm really living what I'm saying. And it's really hard, right, because there's been fallout from that. And it's been tough, but I know it's the right thing to do. And so that's to me, I always thought, when things are hard, can I do what I'm saying? Can I really do it? And so every time I do it, I'm like, yeah, I didn't even, like in that moment I did, my instinct was to do that. Yeah, I nailed it. And there's sometimes where I'm like, I didn't do the right thing there. I hesitated, or I didn't say something when I should have. And so, I think it's just constantly reminding yourself that it's like, it's your whole life it's going to take to do this, right? And then, so I think it's just recognizing it's not this big, easy fix. It's all these little things that are going to add up to something, and it's going to add up over time. And so if I remind myself of that, and I keep going, I think in 10 years, I'm going to come back and high five like me today to be like, yeah, 5 years, there were some changes we did and good for us. But yeah, so I think that's how I'm kind of thinking of it right now, because at first it gets overwhelming, because it's really hard to change the thing you can't see.
Yes.
And that's really, really, really hard. But you've got to do it. So how do you do it? And so you do it and you're messy and you're awkward and you mess it up, but you just still got to keep going anyway. So I just kind of remind, when I don't get it right, I kind of remind myself that, and then what can I learn from it, and what else can I change? And so I think it's just messy kind of work, but it's got to happen, because like no one can have the excuse anymore. So how can you, that's worse to me, right? Like knowing and not doing anything, that's worse.
Yeah.
One thing to be ignorant. We can't all know everything, but boy, when you know and you're going to keep doing it, what are you doing? Like, that's just worse. No, that's worse. Can't do that. So, yeah.
So we were discussing, Tanya and I, that like we've gone from graphic design and we're now trying to move into inclusive design solely. And in doing that, one thing that came up when we were putting everything together, like for Manifold, the brand, the website, launching the website, we realized that an overlap is visual accessibility. So I did not put together the site. Like Tanya Nahin designed it, and I completely resigned from my graphic design duties on this project. But I watched how much work went into it, because one thing we wanted to ensure is if our company is about inclusive design and accessibility, then our site needs to be fully accessible. So I watched, and they did so much work on the back end of the site, to make sure that the screen readers would work and that the colors and the text, they all pass all the accessibility checks and so forth. And I just felt like for some reason, I don't feel like that mindfulness and awareness of visual accessibility was there when I was learning graphic design. Like we did so much emphasis on legibility through typography, but not legibility in terms of disability. And it seems like a really big gap it's not something that we focus on.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think it goes back to my earlier kind of comment where I was saying how like, as I was a practicing designer, I recognized I was missing so much of like, it was like my education needed to be like a decade long so I could cover off all these things. Because in practice, you start to realize there's these gaps, right? Accessibility, ageism, sexism, racism, like all of these things. And that's what I think, like that's, the cultural components of graphic design hides in plain sight. It really does. So yeah, exactly. I think I agree. My education did not cover off a lot of that. And it's a lot of stuff I learned in practice. And as I went along. but I think there is change coming in that regard. Like I know we just redesigned our curriculum at the Institute, and we really favored some of the type classes in the early years, and those type classes do start to get at that information, to say too about what it means to have something be accessible. So I know we have a great sessional faculty member, and that's one of his areas of expertise, and actually why he was hired to teach type was because of accessibility. So there was even emphasis put on place to do that. And even us, we've been working to with our hiring strategies, really looking at how we can get better at ensuring we have a better representation with faculty. So even culturally, as well as things like accessibility. So it's happening, but it's, these things, they're interesting to watch unfold too, because you see how excited the students get to learn it. Like they feel like they're learning something real, quote unquote, right? Like I'm learning this real thing. And it's like, yeah, this is a real thing. So having production components, within, and I think a lot of times when we think of production, we think of printing, but that's not the case, right? Like there's production means how does this thing get produced and distributed? And that is a big piece of that. So
yeah,
I would argue there's a lot of work being done to make that shift happen in the education.
Yeah, you're right. You always bring the right language to what I don't know how to say it. I was like, oh yeah, that is production. When you were saying, I don't know why I did not put it in that category before, because I think I learned production when I was on the job. Like I got like a crash course when I was doing my degree, but I really learned it when I went into advertising, and then that was the component of my on the job learning. So
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's most of us. Like we did have a wee bit of production in class, because I think, like when I was studying, we did have a bit of production, but no, it is mostly on the job that you learn those things, right? Because it's like because those systems are put in place and you work with those systems, and those systems aren't always put in place in educational assignments. I know, like for example, this year, we actually, in the class I was talking about that we've written with my colleague, we actually taught a research method in that class. We've never taught research methods in the studio classes. So we actually taught people how to interview. So I was so excited, like here you are, second year, graphic design, and you're going to learn how to conduct an interview respectfully. We wrote an RAB application for the class. We taught people and explained to people about respectful practices when you interview, how to handle the data. So it's all that production, like where does this person's data go? What do you do with it? What's raw data? How do you then anonymize it? How do you make it for production? How do you get the sign off from the person you've interviewed? And then they made this motion graphic response to that piece. So they're learning making practices, but they're also learning the research methods. So I think we're starting to get to a point in our culture where we can actually, like in our design studio culture, actually start to bring these things in. And that to me is part of the production as well. What happens before you make the graphic design thing? Actually putting it into place. So things like research methods that will be very practical for many of these students, and these production pieces, accessibility. In Ontario, we have the AODA. So we have to be compliant with these things. Like they're actually like policy here in our province and in our country. We have policies around, accessibility. So as a graphic designer, you better know them, right? And if they don't get baked into the studio practice like holistically, like you won't have those habits, and they really are habits.
So our last question is about designing for more inclusive representation. We were talking about, in graphic design or in visual communication, messaging tends to skew towards younger people and tends to forget about more mature people, for example, unless maybe the product is specifically intended for senior citizens or a specific age group or something. And even then, graphic designers can fail in packaging, for example, like using really small type when it's a product for a more mature age group. That said, packaging design is very limiting in itself. But with culture and society always skewing towards a certain type of representation, I don't even know how it's possible, but how do you think it's possible for designers to be more mindful of these type of things and building more inclusion?
That's a great question. And there's so many answers to that. I think because again, we have to think about the system at play, right? So there's a couple things that are happening. So I think a lot about packaging. I remember there was a food company who made a package that was biodegradable, and it was like a potato chip or a popcorn, and I'm sorry, I can't remember which company it was. But what they did was they made this biodegradable packaging, which everyone's like, amazing, right? Because you have those foil packages that these snacks come in. It's not recyclable, it's garbage, and it's temporary. Like you eat your snack and then it gets thrown away. So they created this thing. But what happened was the packaging was super loud, like super loud, so it would crinkle. And it turned out that they received like an incredibly high number of complaints about this package. And the reason why is people were taking the package and they were hiding it. So maybe it was like there was a lot of these moms would like take the package and like try to eat one, and then the kids would hear it and then like, oh, my cookie, and then they got all these complaints. So here this company is trying to actually make a package that's biodegradable, amazing, and for all the right reasons. So sustainability is huge and should be important in any packaged item. But it was the consumer response to the package that they actually took it off the shelf. And it was for this really, really, and it was like repeated enough that it became kind of a thing. Like it was this thing why this package got canceled. And I think about it with all kinds, but like that's just one example, but there's so many, like, so that idea of that model that you're hiring, people sometimes, they won't buy things if they're like, well, that's not what I really look like. So there's a societal component, like we've made a world where we're trapped by our own nonsense, right? I know at the university we're having trouble getting students to turn their screens on. So we teach to all these little Zoom or Teams, Microsoft Team dots, right? Like these little, they're not people, they're little shapes. And so one student said, well, I don't want to put my screen on because I don't like the way I look. And that's like they're not being vain. They're just self-conscious. Well, no wonder somebody's self-conscious. Look at the world we've created. We told people they have to look a certain way. They have to behave a certain way. So we've created this world that traps us in these kinds of things. So we produce packaging because, people want it to sell. So they're beholden to a product to sell it. So, it's so that we have to almost create a culture that accepts those changes too. Right? So I think there's this back and forth because there's a cycle here. It's the consumer as well as the producer. But I think, so that's sort of my big picture thought on that. But I think more specifically, and really to get to your question, that's all well and good, Nancy, you point your finger at somebody else. Nice job. What are you accountable for? So let's talk about that, because I think that's really more what your question is getting at, right? Is like, what are we accountable for? And this is one of the things about the myth of the rock star designer, right? Where you're the designer, you're really designing for yourself. So I think the question comes down to like, how do we remind ourselves as designers, we're not designing for ourselves. So who are we designing for? So this is where, that's the best question, right? Like, who is this for? So, and then there's another sort of societal or a systematic piece here too with like packaging, because so much of that is held to regulation and policy, right? So the point size, it can't be below this, it can't be above that. So some of those packages, yeah, you're going to hit a certain age, you're getting reading glasses, and I don't know if some of that packaging, if you realistically could make it bigger, right? But what's interesting is where we can change the way the packaging comes together, do we even know or think to do it? And I think that's what it comes down to. Sometimes you are beholden to the system, but have you even considered it? And has it been baked in? And I think that's where we're accountable. So when we teach design, what are we teaching is important? How much of what we teach do we talk about the form and the structure and the visuals and the elements and the aesthetic? We really talk aesthetically about the work, but how much do we talk about who needs it and who we're designing for? And so I think if that gets included in the actual design education, are we doing a good job of that? You know what, we could do a lot better than I think what we're doing now. But you know, like I think there's so many different systems. So I think it's like a multi-pronged approach, because we have to look at the other systems that are in play too. So how do we make it acceptable? You know, like here we have somebody like a musician like Harry Styles really changing up the perception of male fashion, right? We all hear about him now. He's all on these covers of Vogue, and he's wearing pearls and earrings and a lot of dress that would be, he's shopping in women's sections. Now we had a moment of this in the 70s with music, right, with glam rock, but here we have this again now. Interestingly, why are we having this again in terms of representations of clothing? We had it in the 70s. It was a trend. And so is Harry Styles, is he going to be a trend, or does he actually affect change? So these are the things I'm always kind of curious about, right? Like these bigger picture system things, like what are we doing as a society to make these things like desirable and seen? So I think, what are we accountable to? What are we as citizens or members of the community accountable to? And so I think there's like it's a multi-pronged kind of an issue. And I think, yeah, but again, I think designers, we have to start with ourselves. And I actually think that's on a lot of the educators, like, what are we doing about that? And that's one area I think we could definitely do better. I know I'm seeing changes, but are they as fast and as urgent as we could make them? If I'm critical of us, probably not as urgent as I think we probably should be doing it. Yeah.
So this is my last question, a bonus question. Since I had you as my advisor, and I've always found you to have like a lot of empathy, and you're very non-judgmental and inclusive, basically. And I find that you lead by example. So I wanted to get your opinion on this. There's a lot that's happened this last year, and a lot of people have the right intention and they want to do good, but they don't necessarily know where to start. And they may not be intellectuals or academics as such like us, and so they lack the information on history and so forth, but they want to do the right thing. What is one thing, a thought or a belief, that you would suggest to an average person on the street to help them begin shifting their mindset towards being more inclusive?
Oh, that's such a good question. Like, what? I don't know. Like, part of my go-to answer, I think, on something along these lines is it's like asking what kind of stuff are you bringing into your space. And I think it can be simple as things like, what TV shows do you watch? What movies do you watch? And the big one, like, what books do you read? Right? So I think it's about starting there, right? Like, do people have a relationship with stories from people who aren't from their world? And I think that's what I would say is, like, really try to reach past your go-to things. Like, it's really easy to kind of go to your staple forms of entertainment, but I think that could be a really accessible way for people to start to think outside of their own bubbles, right? And that's something I always try to do. Like, I'm always trying to read new authors or read new areas of things. But not everybody's a reader, right? Like, if you hate reading, that will be torture for you, right? And I love reading. I love it. It's and I've only done all this academic reading, but I can't wait to read like something not work related. It's going to be amazing. So one day I'm going to do it. And read anything, like even read things you don't believe in. Like, I think that's great. I remember when, this is terrible. Like, remember when Twilight came out and it was like super popular? Do you remember that book series, like the vampires all sparkly? And people made fun of me. They're like, Nancy, how can you be reading that? And I'm like, don't be so judgy. A lot of people are connecting with that book, and I want to know why. So it's like being curious. It was really a hard book for me to read because it was not for me. It's everything it was very hard. But I got through it, and I learned things. And so I thought to myself, sometimes you just, like, if something's popular, find out why. Like, don't be so judgy. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's what you got to do sometimes. And I ended up having some really great conversations after reading that book because, people were super into it. So then I could say to people like, what, you loved this book, like, tell me about it. But if I hadn't read it, I couldn't have the conversation. I was just being this jerk without even knowing what I was talking about. So you have to experience some things in order to understand them the best you can, but then ask questions of other people. So I think, it's about weighing in on and getting into spaces where you're uncomfortable, even if it's something as easy as reading Twilight. Like, it seems so, like, it's just a silly thing to say, but like, it's kind of like being okay to follow your curiosity and read something you don't connect with, or watch something that's not your taste, but try to figure out why, right? Like, so I guess be reflective. And I find sometimes the easiest way you can do that is just by watching entertainment. And I remember a student once saying to me, "Oh, Nancy, like, I just want to watch a show. I don't want to critique it." And I was like, I know, but man, there's so much in there if you dig for it, right? So I think even just starting with something as simple as a TV show or a video game, start with Netflix, start with a book, something that's accessible. Like, meet yourself where you're at. Do you know what I mean? Like, where are you at? And start there. And I think that's for me the only way I could ever do anything. I wish I was somebody else. I wish I was this other amazing person who knew all these great things. But I'm just me. So I'm going to start where I'm at, So I found that's kind of been the pathway for me, like what's accessible to me, and then kind of go from there. So I think that it builds a long way for you to start to hear other people's stories. And even if you don't like them, even questioning why you don't like them, or questioning why you do like them, right? Like, what are you getting out of this? And so that reflective kind of practice with things that are as simple as entertainment, I don't know, they seem to be, that could be a good way. And then I would love, of course, to know how other people do it, because that'd be cool to know too. But
so meet yourself where you are, question things, follow your curiosity.
Yeah. And don't be embarrassed to read Twilight on the subway. You'll have a good conversation.
I love that advice.
Right?
Yeah, of course. If people like something, instead of like just critiquing, get to know why. Why do they connect?
Yeah, like a lot of people really connected to that book, man. Like, people, it was like a phenomenon. So that's the other thing too. Like, as a designer, how can you not be curious what people are drawn to? Like, I think that's, I think that's important. Like, always be curious, right, about things. Otherwise, the world gets pretty boring, because you're just always going back to the same places. Like, aren't you curious about what else is out there? And that's a great way to learn. I guess a lot of things for me connect to story, right? Like, you really do, like, tell me a story, and then I'll get to know you better, because you're going to tell me how you see the world. And I can only see the world I'm so limited. I can only see the world through my own eyes. That's really boring. So you're going to write something for me. You're going to make something for me. Oh man, I get to experience that. I get to know who you, that's great. Like, all these people spending all their lives making things, and you get to just enjoy them and study them and know it. Like, man, that's amazing.
This was really, really great and inspiring. Thank you very much, Nancy.
I really hope that you got something meaningful from that chat. I definitely did. And if you would like to connect with Nancy, please check out the description of this episode, and you can find out more about Manifold and what we're up to by heading to our website, hellomanifold.com, or follow us on social media. The handle is @HelloManifold.